All right. Welcome to the podcast. This is episode 1 of Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, where I tell the story of how a guy like me, a decorated trial attorney and business owner and writer and author, went from rags to riches, where I started my career out, or my life out, as a high school dropout addicted to drugs and with a criminal record trying to survive extreme poverty. So how did that guy turn things around and get to the guy before you now making a podcast? Well, that's where the story lies, in the journey. And as long as I've been alive, I think I've wanted to tell stories. I've been a storyteller at heart. And so this podcast is a fruition of that dream and that goal and that want and desire that's lived in my heart since I was a child. You might have seen some of my writing in Bugle, where I've done some work, as well as other journals and various literary stories, or you might never heard of me at all. I'm, like I said, a trial attorney and a business owner, and now I'm here as a podcaster. And so sit back and enjoy the ride. I think my story, or the story I have to tell you, is a roller coaster that speaks to the strength of the American dream when pursued. And so buckle up and sit back and grab your popcorn and enjoy my story, which is the Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Now, we are all the victims of our own decision-making. As agents of free will and individuals who act and make choices, we are eternally bound to suffer the consequences or reap the rewards of our actions. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Our lives don't exist in a vacuum. Every decision, every action, every choice has a cascading effect on the pathways our future selves can walk and the destinations we will arrive at. In that way, the breath of a single butterfly's wings will impact where wind currents blow 10,000 miles away. Even if our lives are fated to a specific outcome, as agents of free will, our choices determine our experiences. A right turn or a left turn at the start of a journey might not change the final destination, but it will change how you get there. And in that way, the sum of our lives is just the collection of individual actions we made or didn't make. This very story is the product of a collection of individual actions, each necessary to bring about its existence. It's the sum of so many choices. Looking back, it's much easier to see all of the connective tissue between each action and the opposite reaction, and how my life developed out of the good or bad choices I made. And in reflection, even at the beginning of my life, I still knew right from wrong, even if I didn't always fully comprehend the corresponding consequences. In sort of a banal way, avoiding hardship is often as simple as listening to your conscience and stepping in the direction opposite of the bad vibes. This story is also an Odyssey, and an Odyssey isn't supposed to be a parable or an apologue to some moral truth. An Odyssey is an allegory. Rather, it is a journey of hardship and triumph, a journey marked by many changes in fortune. If there's some moral that shines through in Homer's Odyssey or in the epic tales of Gilgamesh, it's revealed to us, the audience, through the individual actions of our heroes, not through the supportive argument of the narrator. It's sort of an originalist argument for showing versus telling. And that's exactly what I hope to accomplish for the listeners of my story. If there's a moral that's revealed to you, I hope that you arrive at it through seeing the journey of struggle and hardship through the lens of a high school dropout like me. Now, certain liberties in the narration of this story were necessary to protect the identity of folks who might not otherwise want to find the teenage version of themselves memorialized forever on the internet. So names and places might have been changed as a consequence of that effort. Additionally, as a survivor of a traumatic brain injury, my memory is imperfect. And at times I relied on the better memory of others who shared these lived experiences with me to fully capture the essence of each moment in the story. I've endeavored to write an absolutely true and honest account of the Odyssey that has been my life. And so I hope you can forgive any liberties made or lapses in memory in taking such an accounting. I found that truthful and diligent attention to objectivity and narrative has a naturally cathartic effect. And so in writing this story, I was able to appreciate those benefits to the fullest. And so I invite you to laugh, cry, grow with me on this journey, this quest of sorts of a teenage dirtbag who is trying to find out if there is still a path left for him to reach a better life after making so many of his own mistakes. I do hope it means something to you, as my life is in your hands. Now let's get to the early years. I was born in Seattle, Washington. I was the second child by a couple of years. My older brother Nathan wasn't particularly excited to welcome competition into the home, but he tolerated me. And my mom and dad were married and living in Skyway at the time, which is a suburb of the city of Renton, just a little south of Seattle. I don't have any memories of those early years. My grandma Mildred, who owned the Skyway house, had passed away before I was born, and my dad was a caretaker at the house as a part of her sort of estate planning. He was the baby of the family, the youngest brother of 5 sons, and younger than his next brother by about 15 years. And so his mom was most concerned about her youngest still pulling it together, and asked him to be caretaker of her house when she died. But this was caused some bitterness between his brothers at that decision, and so they all had agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. My dad and his mom had used that nest egg to purchase a small house in Bonnie Lake, and that's where life really began for me. Growing up in Bonnie Lake is where most of my core childhood memories reside. I think my earliest memory is from my 3rd birthday. My mom had gotten me a white t-shirt with dinosaurs on it that changed colors when it was placed in the dryer for a few minutes. She also had gotten me a Ken doll from the Barbie series or franchise. Some other relatives had gotten me a G.I. Joe off-road vehicle toy, and I remember distinctly putting pajamas on Ken and getting him all dressed up to drive around in the .50 caliber gun truck. My mom told me later that she had tried to give me dolls to my brother and me so we wouldn't be such rough boys. She also enrolled us in dance and gymnastics. For all her efforts, I don't really think it worked. Within a few years, though, of living in that Bonnie Lake house, my parents had a couple more kids, 4 of us in total, 2 girls and 2 boys. Nathan was the oldest, then myself, my sister Alicia, and then our baby sister Christy, who came last at about 5 years my junior. And our house was located across the street from Lake Tapps, just a stone's throw from Inlet Island. Now, living near the lake afforded our childhoods with many simple pleasures. I could walk down to the causeway with a bucket and a fishing pole and waste away my spring days casting lines, or spend all summer walking down to Jenks Park to swim on the long wooden docks and listen to the peacocks sing. My parents were both working class. My dad worked at Boeing, doing everything from operating cranes to bending numerical tubes. He worked overtime most weekends and did his best to provide for us kids. I think he really viewed his role as our father foremost to be our provider. So where he may not have been always kind to me, he was at least dependable. His dad had died when he was 12 from tuberculosis, and so he never really learned how to be a good dad. He did his best, but he had a hard time keeping an even hand with me. Out of all my siblings, I got under his skin more than the others, and I found myself under his thumb more often than not. My mom was a part-time preschool teacher and later worked at our local church coordinating the children's ministry program. She'd grown up poor and was the oldest of her 3 siblings, and they'd seen some hard times growing up, but she was the first in her family to really clean up her life, and so she often was the center of support for her sisters and brother, who struggled with substance abuse throughout my entire childhood. Now, we never really had money, but we were rich in other ways. My summers were spent meandering the neighborhood with friends, swimming down at the lake, building forts in the woods adjacent to our house, making swords out of sticks, all of the seminal childhood experiences. And during the winter each year, they would drain lake taps and then refill it again in the spring. And that made a great time for us kids. The lake was man-made and built from runoff from the nearby White River that ran along Buckley to Auburn. And there was an old substation down at the end of the lake that the county had used to generate power. But the primary function was really to support summer recreation opportunities like boating and swimming at the nearby parks on the lake, so that it would help bring in sort of tourist activity and recreation to the area and really keep a clean lake water. So when the lake was drained, it looked like a moonscape, pocked with craters and hundreds of stumps serving as ghosts of forests gone by. There was an entire river systems that carved valleys through the mud of the lakebed once the waters receded. As children, we would wander the empty lakebed for days, scavenging for treasures lost by summer boaters or collecting the golf balls launched from the shoreline of the local golf course. We would bathe in the mud like it was clean water, enjoying just being dirty, and on one occasion, I was playing down in the lake bed with some of the other neighborhood kids. My best friend, Casey, he lived about 5 houses down from me, and my brother had walked down to play in the muddy shoreline along the causeway that had connected the nearby island to the mainland. The neighbor girl, Sheila, had come down to play as well, but she wasn't really a regular in our group. Now, Canada geese were in the area nesting, as they routinely did, and we had stumbled upon a nest, or a hen atop her nest. Now, naturally curious kids as we were, we tossed a rock or two towards the nest. Not to throw anyone under the bus, but I was much less likely the provocateur in these kind of situations. My brother was a bit of an agent of chaos at his age, and being a few years older than us, he could always get Casey and myself to go along with most of his bad plans. So we kept throwing rocks, and the goose would sit up and hiss at us, and we would, laugh jovially before tossing another small stone. But after a couple of these hissing sessions, the mother goose had sort of bent her head back and honked into the air in a sort of warning call, or some kind of call for help. We laughed, and she did it again. And then we laughed again. But then on the horizon, like blue angels streaking through the skyline, a handful of nearby geese were flying into the rescue. And I pointed, saying, guys, I think we better get out of here. But Casey and Nathan continued to laugh and ignore the impending danger. Sheila looked nervous, but she just kind of stood by, and Before really anyone could react, these geese flew in to attack. A large male landed on Sheila and just started ravaging her hair and face. And I remember seeing this long neck of a goose just violently swinging around like the arms of some kind of wacky inflatable arm man. She screamed and ran with this goose attached to her head, and we just scattered and panicked. Quickly, we were all scrambling through the mud with geese just dive bombing our little bodies as we tried to scramble and make it home. I remember I turned back to Nathan and Casey and asked, "What about Sheila?" And they turned to me in unison, replying, "Leave her," as they were running and falling over themselves in the mud. I look over my shoulder and, she seemed to be faring fairly okay in a fetal position. So I continued to run. More geese flew in, and at this point it looked like a goose-nado forming out of the lake bed. The geese just turned in this winding gyre as they dove from above, and I launched onto the causeway and ran the rest of the way home. And hours later, Sheila had arrived back at the house, and she had peck marks and was missing some hair, and Nathan and Casey came back too, and they were covered in mud and had bruises from the attack, but I was relatively unscathed, and I learned a very important lesson that day, that you don't have to outrun the goose, you just have to outrun your friends. But yeah, times were generally good for us. There wasn't any social media. Phone calls still happened on landlines, and for most of my childhood, we didn't even have caller ID. And so we all had to answer the phone blind, to who was on the other end. And also I know what I thought, but landlines were like mostly shared by a household. So if I wanted to call a girl, I would just have to pray that her dad didn't answer the phone first. So I didn't make a lot of phone calls to girls. Or if there was a friend who called me, I would have to go throughout my house and scan the other phones to make sure that my siblings or my parents weren't listening into whatever nefarious conversation I was having. So it was a unique time, and one distinctly different from the one we live in now. We had an old desktop computer connected to the internet with Juno. Internet came on CDs in the mail at that time. But dial-up internet was slow. And as kids, I only used it like at the school to look up like a Pokemon or something. So really our computer was really only good for a game of solitaire or ski free. And my parents, they didn't care very much to make sure we had the most updated technology. Rather, they would take whatever kind of hand-me-down we could get, whether it was at a garage sale. Eventually, we were given an old Atari from some friends. And so we played that pretty often as kids, but most of our adventures happened outside. There was plenty to do out in the world just by getting out and in it. Our family vacations were simple. We would take local trips to Leavenworth or camping trips to the nearby state parks. Our family's general lack of money sort of framed out the types of experiences we could have. And so we had a general expectation of how we'd spend our time. That meant the things that we did and valued were simple. Rather than this big fancy dinner at a restaurant, we would have a picnic at Riverside Park over peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I don't feel like I ever was missing out for having a simple life or childhood. Growing up by the lake, though, did result in some pretty dramatic disparities in socioeconomic conditions from one neighbor to the next, where some of our neighbors were of moderate means, like us. Some neighbors were very wealthy, and so I was able to sort of see both sides of things. My best friend Casey was from a working class family like me, and his dad worked at Boeing like my dad. But across the street from Casey was lakefront property, and that's where our friend Taylor lived. And Taylor's dad was a dentist, and their house was about as fancy as you could get. He had a freaking laser disc player And he was the first kid in our neighborhood to get a Nintendo 64. His dad was also like a big fan of University of Washington and had a decorated backyard in purple and gold flowers that all were in the shape of like a giant U and W. And so I think as a kid, when I imagined successful people, those were the kind of people I thought of. My whole extended family was pretty poor generally, and so it was easy for me to see the difference. My grandpa Duane, he was sort of an Appalachian Irish hillbilly, and he was the patriarch of our family, but had come up picking hops and berries in the Ording Valley for just a few pennies a day. He had dropped out of school in the 6th grade and wore cowboy boots because he never learned how to tie his shoes. So, that was like our world. And he was a sincere cheapskate, but I could never fault him for it because that was like how he was raised. It was part of his upbringing. He'd, robbed a few grocery stores in his younger years and did a little time for that, but he'd cleaned up his act and turned to God by the time us kids were around. And so we always looked at him, in an admirable way. He'd raced cars and snowmobiles for a while, but ultimately he ended up working as a lineman at Boeing like most of the folks in our area. As a kid, I have some of the earliest memories of my grandfather are of him just rolling up in his Nissan pickup truck, kicking open his doors and turning up the radio to the highest volume, and then just blasting country gospel music. He would yodel loudly and could be spotted by this large cowboy hat and his belt buckles. He was kind of always larger than life for me. When my mom was working or needed a break, my Grandma Joy was sort of our primary caregiver for me and my siblings, and so we got to see my Grandpa Duane and my Grandma Joy often. But she divorced my Grandpa Duane because she said she couldn't take living with him. She complained that he would save coffee grounds for weeks on end, make all of his pots of coffee on the same filter until mold set in, or he would save sauce packets from the fast food restaurants rather than buying actual condiments for the household. And he refused to believe in expiration dates and would only throw food out once a sour smell set in. So, to be fair, my grandpa could be an ornery son of a gun. I remember a few times really watching him, getting into it with someone over something, whether it was a relative or a neighbor who had pushed his buttons the wrong way and set him off. And so even as a kid, it was easy to imagine him as maybe a difficult person to live with. So my Grandma Joy remarried to a man named Russ instead, and I really liked Russ. I remember him pretty well still, but life got the best of Russ, and he shot himself in the head. My grandma came home one day to find his body in her kitchen with a gunshot wound, and as a kid, I would close my eyes and sort of unintentionally picture the stairs leading up to the sliding glass door in the kitchen and imagine how it all happened there. Russ's funeral was my first. My grandma was sad for a while after that, but she had moved on after some time and had met a man named Dennis. And he was a nice guy too. But they didn't stay together for very long because she caught him looking at porn one day on her computer and kicked him out of the house. And I remember all of my family trying to keep it a secret from us kids, the porn. But we all knew right away by connecting the different breadcrumbs we'd heard from various relatives, which goes to speak to the idea that kids really do inevitably just figure out everything that's going on, whether you try to conceal it or not. So I had a lot of fun as a kid, though. My extended family was close part of our daily operations as well. I had a couple aunts and uncles that I saw often too. My Aunt Cheryl is my mom's sister, and her two sons, Chance and Cole, came over often to spend time with us as kids. And Chance and Cole were about the same age as my sisters, and so I thought it was pretty great to have a couple younger boys to sort of be an older brother for. They really were kind of like a second set of siblings for us. There were, a few times the kids were beat up by a bad boyfriend of Cheryl's or otherwise in a bad spot. And so they would come and stay with us for a bit or with my grandpa or grandma. And for the most part of my childhood, they were around, just always a present part of the gang. My Uncle Wayne, too, was a big part of my childhood. He had really invested in me early on and built me up. I had dreamed of playing in an orchestra when I was about, 8 or so. And so my mom rented me a violin from the local music shop and encouraged me to practice lessons. And so I took some for a bit in classical violin, but I really struggled with reading music. So my classical violin teacher recommended I try fiddle, which was played by ear and memory. And once I started that, I really took to fiddle fairly quickly. It was fun for me, and I enjoyed the pace. And my Uncle Wayne, he treated me like just the biggest celebrity fiddle player. He would take me to local violin shops and show me off to the owners, impressing them with my fiddle skills, at the age of 11 or 12. And admittedly, I was pretty damn good. But I was made better by him believing in me. He was special in that way. And, and while he was a jokester and always around for the holidays and Sunday dinners, he just became a big part of my life and childhood. And throughout my childhood, he was really sort of my fondest relative. I never met my dad's parents because both were dead before I was born. He had 4 brothers. My dad's brother, Michael, which is my namesake, had died in a horrible road rage incident when my dad was about 5. And another of his brothers, Bill, I'd never met due to a dispute he had with my dad over their sort of way they handled his mother's inheritance or something to that degree. And so on the McCorkle side of things, I really only knew my Uncle Gary and my Uncle Daryl. My dad wasn't really good at keeping up with his family, and so he just didn't invest the time into us kids meeting or getting to know his family either. We never really talked about his dad or what he was like, nor did he really talk about his mom or his brother, Michael. And each of them became like a giant mystery to me, sort of a question mark in my mind. I didn't know what they were like or how they were like, and it wasn't for lack of questions on my part. I just think it was too painful for my dad to talk about. And so really, in a sense, my childhood was mostly nurtured and informed by the connections I had to my mother's side of the family, which was the wild and at times crazy Appalachian Irish trailer park poor side of the family known as the Ryans. And all things considered, my childhood was mostly normal. There were some moments of verbal abuse, but nothing too oppressive. As I mentioned before, I stuck out as a pain in my dad's neck, and he couldn't really figure out how to deal with it. And so there would be some shout downs or broken furniture, but it didn't really feel inconsistent with the lives of the other kids on my block, so I never was too worried about it. It didn't shake me up. I was a well-behaved child and otherwise liked by everybody else around me, and so it didn't really rattle my system too much to the core. I went to church every Sunday and always minded my manners, and at least, for the sake of my parents. My friends' moms had always paid me compliments, really, for how well-behaved I was, and that alone motivated me to keep earning their favor. And so I spent, a good part of my childhood just being a good kid, daydreaming about growing up to be a zoologist or having some career in the rearing of animals or the sciences. And if you'd asked me, I would have told you that I would never ever be getting married or having kids because for some reason I was deathly afraid to admit to anyone that I was actually obsessed with girls. I thought there would be some serious Christian judgment if I admitted it was true. And so I would always shield myself away from revealing my many crushes to anyone who asked. The irony of that is that I always, or if, at least to memory, I don't think there was a single time where I didn't have a crush on someone or somebody, but no one else needed to know that. And I think having a crush at any given time, in a sense, fueled my existence as a child and on into adulthood. I would imagine up elaborate ways to capture my various crushes' attention, like doing backflips off the classroom desks or hitting a home run in kickball and having all of the kids cheer and lift me up. But most of those scenarios were unfortunately beyond my physical ability. My first girlfriend, however, was Audrey in the 4th grade, but it only lasted for about a day before she just decided on a whim to break up with me. Young love, I know. But I wanted a girlfriend every day leading up to that moment and every day from that moment on. So for me, unfortunately, it wouldn't happen again until I was in middle school, I think. I don't know why, but I never seemed to be able to communicate my feelings to the objects of my affection. My fear of rejection, I suppose, overcame me each time, and so I would pine and daydream of marriage with all of the different girls in my life, but never would take any real action towards affecting their attention. And in hindsight, I think that the feeling was likely mutual with many of my childhood crushes, but they likely were suffering from the same fears and reservations as me. Really, it's funny looking back at how many times throughout the history of mankind that Cupid's arrow has missed its mark, but for the lack of courage in one or two hopeful souls. Eventually, though, my family had outgrown our small house by the lake, and my parents decided to move us across town to a newer housing development called Brookwater, with new prospects. We moved from a traditional suburb akin to what you might find in the 70s or an 80s neighborhood to a more modern housing development, where everything looked the same. The yards were spaced out in little small boxes, kind of like that show Weeds. I was 15 when we made the move, and looking back on it now, it really was like a changing of eras. I had left childhood behind and now was in a new period of adolescence. A new house, a new neighbors, new experiences to carve out, a new school to attend, and all during the ferocity of puberty. It was an exciting time for me, but now, in reflection, the transition was also crushing for me, and it happened all at once. All right, guys, that wraps up our first episode of Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Like and subscribe below if you haven't already, and stay tuned for another episode. Thanks for watching.